Guild Wars, Sea of Sorrows. Chapter 28. The Gabrian's Comet was a small schooner, less than 200 feet long, and dwarfed by pinnaces such as the Pride and big clippers such as the Nomad II. Although she typically carried a crew of around 20, tonight she had only 5 sailors working amid her rigging. One of them was a human. 2 were Char, Fasher, and Awesome. The other 2 were Norn. When Braun's brother, Grim, heard about their plan, he promptly stormed into the Crow's Nest Tavern and challenged his brother to a fight to decide which one of them would go. After they spent 2 hours arguing, breaking chairs over one another, and wheedling the barmaids for more alcohol, Kobaya gave in and brought both. It was far easier than paying their bar tab. Sanctum Harbor rippled with a wayward southern wind that bled cold from the shiver peaks. They kept the sails closed as they pushed off from the pier, letting the last of the outgoing tide draw them from shore. Only when they were completely surrounded by the waters of the harbor and the tide began to turn inward did they unfurl the sails, dark canvas, stained black with oil from a midnight yew. Harder to see against the night sky. The wind sang in the taut rigging, swelling the canvases that swayed against the 2 small masts. It had been years since Kobaya had been at sea, and the salt spray and rolling bow of the deck invigorated him despite the circumstances. He stood in the aft of the ship, looking back at the lights of the harbor, searching for the spires of the little chapel on Deverell Island. They'd built it only a few years ago, and Kobaya had feared the other residents of the city might not take kindly to Creodan religion in their midst. To his surprise, the non-humans had been supportive. Several of the city's Norn helped carve the great oak beams of the ceiling, and an Asteran inventor had engineered self-illuminating stained glass windows, just so the little shrine would be hospitable at night. Fixing his eyes on it, Kobaya murmured a prayer to each of the 6 gods of his people, wishing for the best. Grenth, god of death. Balthazar, god of war. Lissa, goddess of beauty. Cormir, goddess of truth. Melandru, goddess of the earth. And on the highest point, Duena, the merciful, sweet, and gentle comforter of the soul. He could still hear the priest's voice, trying to console him. Pray to her, young man. She will bring you peace. Without meaning to, his mind leapt back to the day he'd first left Lion's Arch, remembering how the white sails carrying him out of the city had looked like an angel's wings. It seemed right that he'd tied Bivian's doll to his belt today, as he'd done in the past when he captained the Pride. Kobaya smiled and brushed his fingers over Paula's faded yarn hair. All the time that had passed, from then to now, all the years, all the adventures. So much had changed. We'll be at the edge of the blockade in 15 minutes, sir, if the wind holds. Even if it doesn't, the Norn are moving those oars like mad things. The steerage is made for 6 men to a side, and we've got Braun and Grim. I think those 2 have a bet going as to who can pull harder. Fasher yawned and stretched his arms up over his head with a whining, grunty noise. He tugged on each wrist, loosening the muscles, and then shook himself all over like a dog rising from a nap. After that, we're oars only for another 10 or so, and that should get us to the eastern pyramid marker. Isay said she'd sail there for 3 nights, waiting to see if we showed. There'll be a red lantern hung on her bow, so we can tell the Nomad from the others. The pyramid marker was a set of stones piled high in the ocean, the top of the stack jutting out well above the highest tide. It marked the edge of safe sailing. If a ship sailed any farther toward the eastern coast of the bay, it risked tearing the bottom of its hull against unpredictable ruins, coral, shale, and other dangers beneath the waves. Although the prince's ships might notice the Nomad II sailing close to that edge, they wouldn't think much of it. Isay was one of the best pilots in Tyria, and she knew Sanctum Harbor like no other. The other Creodan captains might even assume she'd been told to watch for ships moving in the currents along the dangerous edge. The Gabrian's comet was small enough that it could hide on the Nomad 2's port side, keeping the Clipper's bulk between the Gabrian's comet and the rest of the ships in the blockade. She'd be hard to spot under casual inspection from afar. The ruse wouldn't have to last long. Kobaya didn't plan to stay. The tide moved beneath them, precisely as Isaiah's rough sketched map indicated. Every piece of wreckage beneath them had been drawn out, with careful timing marked in seconds, to indicate when they should turn their rudder. Each time Fasher gestured to him, Asam pulled on the rudder, shifting the boat's elegant glide through the calm waters of the bay. Although the currents in Sanctum Harbor were a morass of unpredictable fluctuation, Isaiah's map always seemed to predict where the draw would be. Kobaya busied himself by adjusting the sails, and when Fasur called for them to ease, he climbed the mast to the low yardarm and rolled her, rigging down. He secured the dark canvas with sailor's knots, trying to ignore the stiffness that plagued joints once fluent with such labor. "Stay silent, everyone," Kobaya murmured to the crew. "The water carries echoes. We don't want the Cretans to hear us coming." Slowly, her oars piercing the water like sharp-edged knives, the Gabrian's comet slipped to the edge of the blockade. Lanterns glittered in the distance, tied to the gunwales of clippers and larger galleons. Now and again, Kobaya could hear a watchman call the time, or make out fragments of conversation from sailors on the Creodan ships. Most of the armada was stationary, and the patrols moved as Isaiah had indicated. Buoys were fanned out between them, with ropes and nets splayed from one to another, designed to foul the keel and tangle in the rudder of any ship that tried to punch its way through the blockade. The Gabrian's comet avoided them all thanks to Isaiah's carefully drawn map. "She's precise," Fasher rumbled, his voice so soft that Kobaya, standing next to him, had trouble hearing it. Kobaya couldn't help giving in to a little bitterness. "You think that's something?" he whispered coolly. "You should have seen how methodical she was about copying my notes." The Cretans must have been very impressed. Despite himself, Kobaya felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Whatever crazy plan Isaiah was going to propose, thus far her information had been reliable. That eased his mind a bit. Now he could turn his worry toward wondering exactly what she'd felt was so important in the first place. Nodding in agreement, Fasher folded the paper and tucked it into his belt pouch. Squinting, he lifted a hand and pointed across the sea with one long claw. "There, red lantern." Slowly, carefully, the schooner pulled up alongside the Nomad 2. The waves knocked the Gabrian's comet against the much larger ship, tossing it back and forth in a softly bumping rhythm. Kobaya had deliberately kept his craft dark, and the Nomad 2 dimmed her lanterns along the port side, ensuring that the Gabrian's comet would be further hidden from view of the Creodan ships floating some distance away on her other side. Kobaya tightened his sword belt nervously, watching a sailor on the Nomad 2 throw a long rope toward them. Isam caught it, wrapping the end around one of the cleats near the edge of their deck. Once they were tied off, the larger ship slid a board down to them, a makeshift gangplank so they could come aboard. Fasher took Kobaya's wrist in a gesture of brotherhood. "Take Braun and Grim with you. Be careful. Isam and I will keep our weapons out and the comet ready to push off. The minute you're done, don't waste any time with kissy-poo or lovey-dovey stuff. We need to be back through that blockade and into the city's harbor well before dawn." Lovey-dovey, Kobaya stared at his old friend skeptically. "Fasher, women really are a foreign species to you. You realize Issei's more likely to kill me than kiss me, right?" "Speak for yourself," the Char grunted. "I married that Blood Legion minx, if you remember. I know foreplay when I see it." "Don't worry." Kobaya had to stifle his laugh. "This won't take long." He gestured to the brothers and headed up the slippery gangplank. Assembled on the deck were 4 human sailors, wearing linen shirts and breeches, a kerchief in green and gold tied about one man's neck. As the 3 visitors made it up the plank and onto the Nomad 2, The sailors on the deck kept their hands near their cutlasses, taking no chances. The captain's stateroom is this way. One of them crooked his arm for them to follow and walk toward the oak doors on the quarterdeck at the rear of the ship. Although most ships kept hands active, even at night, the Clipper's deck felt all but abandoned. No one was straightening the ropes on the capstan, nor washing the boards, nor standing guard at the bow or the gunnery. The silence unnerved Kobaya, and their footsteps across the broad ship's promenade felt overloud and strange. Bronn frowned as well, exchanging a glance with his brother, and the two closed ranks to stay with Kobaya and the sailors of the Nomad too. Bronn subtly loosed his greatsword in its back sheath. Grim cracked his knuckles, exchanging pleasant smiles with the Cretan sailor walking beside him. Just before the sailors opened the doors to the captain's cabin, Kobaya realized something else. None of the men escorting them across the ship had tattoos, not an anchor or a mermaid, or a pair of crossed swords between the lot of them. They walked stiff-legged rather than rolling with the motion of the waves against the ship, and all four fell into the same rhythm, arms swinging in time, footsteps thumping regularly on the deck boards. These were not sailors. Kobaya paled. Before he could speak, the large doors on the quarterdeck swung open from the other side. Beyond them, he could see the Nomad 2's stateroom. The area was more than a cabin, built to serve as a meeting room for the officers while the ship was at sea. The area within was lit by hanging lanterns bolted to the beams of the ceiling, their tinted panes casting colored light across the well-scrubbed floors and shining brass ornaments. Yet there was no central table for meetings or meals, no sign of a captain's desk or personal effects other than a few wall hangings that Kobaya recognized as Aie's. The furniture had been removed completely, save for a tall, ornamented mahogany chair with opulently covered pillows that rested in the center of the chamber. Even though they had never met before, Kobaya instantly recognized the man seated there. Prince Adair. He was young, only a few years past 20, with a deeply privileged smile and an athlete's graceful form. Soft hands gripped the hilt of a bejeweled sword clipped to his gleaming patent leather belt. The man's skin was olive-toned, his hair the rich auburn common to Cretan nobility. Handsome, but the way he lolled on the chair spoke of conceited superiority in every self-satisfied posture. From his shining black boots to his immaculate green and gold uniform, the man appeared every inch a Cretan soldier, but not a speck of the clothing looked worn or broken in. Adair straightened his sleeves, keeping his eyes gleefully fixed on Kobaya and the others in the doorway. Aise and Tenzin Moran stood to either side of the throne, her hazel eyes unreadable, and his gun holster empty. Marines wearing the uniform of the seraph lined both walls of the chamber, weapons already in their hands. The escorts drew their swords and fenced their 3 captives in the doorway. Hatches on the deck behind them sprang open with a clatter, and Kobaya could hear thumping, pounding footsteps barging up from the hold. "Can't go backward," Kobaya conceded. "Might as well charge." In a flash, he drew his sword. He heard the ringing sound of Bronn's 2-hander coming free of its scabbard, as Grim bellowed a challenge. "Villains!" the younger twin shouted, his voice carrying like a foghorn. "Fight us one-on-one if you dare." He swatted away a sword pointed in his face and charged into the line of guardsmen to their right, plowing one seraph with a haymaker as he drove his knee into a second soldier's gut. It didn't take Grim long to turn that side of the room into a 6-on-1 brawl. Bronn turned to the left, swinging his greatsword in broad strokes over his head to drive their opponents backward. Kobaya took advantage of their escort's surprise to punch one in the jaw with his cutlass hilt. Before the other Cretans could react, Kobaya grabbed one by the shoulder and hurled him into the third, knocking both of them to the floor. With the Norn twins handling the company of Marines, no one stood between Kobaya and the Cretan prince. "I might not make it out of this room," Kobaya said threateningly, storming toward Adair, "but you sure as hell won't." Kobaya, please, Isai begged, stepping in front of the throne. I can't let you hurt him. The gesture was baffling, and Kobaya froze mid-stride, struck by the tears in her eyes and the desperate tone in her voice. Damn it, I say. Kobaya grabbed her shoulder roughly, pushing her aside. This is no time for national loyalty. The man's trying to kill me. He's trying to destroy our city. I know, she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. That wasn't the response he'd expected. He thought she'd fight him, or argue, call him names, or defend the Creadan prince's actions. Instead, Isai stood mutely in his path, willing to take any abuse he'd offer. It wasn't like her at all. His hand softened on her shoulder, cupping it gently instead of gripping with force. Isai, Kobaya wavered, taking in her distress. What has he done to you? Just then, Creadan's soldiers rushed into the room, flooding past Kobaya and hurtling protectively into position around the prince. One of them knocked Isai aside, leveling his blade at Kobaya's heart. The blow was so violent that she tumbled to the ground, striking her head against the floor of the cabin. Isai fell limp, dark hair tumbling across her shoulders to cover her face. More troops pushed through the doorway, overwhelming the twins with sheer numbers. 3 guardsmen forced Braun's sword out of his hands, backing him against a wall with the barrel of a pistol shoved under the Norn's bearded jaw. Grim struggled to cross the room to reach him, dragging 2 men on each of his legs and another hanging behind him from his broad shoulders. He swung wildly, trying to knock his captors off him, but more and more piled on. A few moments later, there were so many sailors on the Norn that Kobaya couldn't see him anymore, and then the entire pile collapsed to the deck, kicking and wriggling in defiance. Your Highness, a guard reported from the Nomad 2's deck. The schooner's cast off. They're getting away. Burn it to the waterline. Use the flaming oil, the prince said lazily, barely bothering to raise his voice. Do I have to tell you people everything? Other soldiers relayed the command, and soon Kobaya heard the twangs of shortbow fire and thuds of oil packets fired from handheld slings. The Creadan stripped Kobaya's weapon from his hand. Keeping their swords pointed at his chest and throat, they forced him against the wall beside Braun. Kobaya didn't take his eyes off Isai. Tenzin pushed his way through the soldiers to kneel at her side. The young marine pressed a torn piece of cloth to a wound on Isaiah's head, where blood was beginning to mat the silken strands. Did you have to hurt her? He said to the soldier sharply. The man stiffened. Just following orders, sir. Even at a distance, Kobaya could hear Isai mutter something smarmy as her eyes fluttered open. Despite the bleak circumstances, her voice was full of life and fire, and Kobaya eased back against the wall with a sigh of relief. Slap the traitors in irons, including the Nomad's officers. Prince Adair gave a lackadaisical wave of his hand. Take them aboard the Balthazar's Trident. We'll handle the interrogations there.